Well, hi again. Last time we were talking on the Marxian view on the labor force size, and I have told that Marx was not that much concentrated on the labor force, um, the population of the society and the relation between the population and the labor force. He rather was more concentrated on the reserve army or the people outside of this labor force who are potentially able to get in and the labor force itself. So according to him, and basically this huge reserve labor force outside of the actual labor force, according to him, was actually the basic thing that was regulating the wages, not the population. I mean, the size of the labor force itself, but rather the size of the reserve labor force itself was regulating the wages. So, according to him, the labor force size was increasing. I mean, the reserve labor force size was decreasing. The labor force itself was absorbing part of the people within the reserve labor force. When level of production increases and basically there's growth in the economic system, in that case, I mean, more workers are needed, so the reserve labor force, members of reserve labor force are joining to the actual labor force, including the people who were previously also not looking for a job. They start looking for a job. People who are already looking for a job start to find jobs. So the labor force, the actual people who are working, number of people who are working, increases. Well, however, this increase and when the actual people who are working increase and the reserve labor force gets smaller, that will in the end increase the wages, which will stop the increase in the production process or decrease the growth rates, which in the end will increase the size of the labor force again. This was very basic analysis of very basically the analysis of Marx on the size of the labor force and size of the reserve labor force. Neoclassical analysis, basically, which is the one we will see today in more detail, focus on the more individual participation problem at an individual level. And basically, this analysis takes everyone, well, as a person who has a certain amount of time available to them, and they can use this time to earn income and consume that, use this income to make consumption. Alternatively, they might not work and use the time for the leisure. And people's preferences between this leisure and the income and consumption that comes with the income is ultimately, according to neoclassical economists, the main factor that determines the labor force participation. I mean, how much people are willing to work and get income to join to the labor, work and get income, which will lead them to join to the labor force, or how many people are basically rather stay at home and spend all their time for leisure. That's the basic question. And in that sense, actually, even though preferences of the people are different, neoclassical economics basically state each person's problem similar to themselves. Although there are certain factors which we might think, I mean, usually in neoclassical economics, we set the problem and we set how the we also describe how people solve this problem. But people with people the possibility of having people whose problems are different, even under neoclassical setting, is discussed relatively less in neoclassical economics, including neoclassical labor economics. Although here we will also discuss that, how different variables within the model might be different for different people, and actually this might lead to basically make the problem itself different for different people. Even within the boundaries of neoclassical economics, same problem with different where certain variables, certain constants are different for different people, might turn into a different problem. Actually, at individual level, mathematically it might still be the same problem, but as people face the problem, they might actually face at individual human level different problems. Well, one interesting case for the labor force participation was participation of the woman, which actually, interestingly, in 19th century, when capitalist system was first developing, and new machinery was actually produced in factories which were previously evolved from the workshops in the medieval era. But those new machinery doesn't make the strength anymore necessary. So initially, women increasingly entered to the labor force in the major capitalist countries. Not only women, but also the children entered to the labor force. And that itself, this new group in the labor force, as well as the migrants who are coming from the land, they come because land production becomes the machines make the agricultural production more efficient, and not that much labor is needed in the agricultural area. And the people were not owning the land; aristocrats were owning the land. So these new migrants also start to join the labor force. Because strength and skills were not anymore necessary. As a result, there was a significant decrease in wage level also. That was one of the consequences of women, children, and the migrants joining the labor force. In the second half of the 19th century, increasingly in different countries, there was call for passing laws that will reduce or decrease or eliminate the child labor and the women who are working. So especially one campaigns that was also directed for this cause was the family wage campaign, which was basically increasing the wage of the man to the level that they can sustain their family, so that their wives and their children would not need to work. Later, this campaign was criticized a little bit because the men were getting the promoters of the campaign were also arguing that women who are working should actually not get a wage as high as the men, because they don't need to sustain a family, while men sustain their family. So this was actually the argument which was for wage differences between men and women, or male or female workers at the time. Of course, some feminist economists, were against it by arguing that actually some women also need to sustain the family, and not necessarily male income was reliable. Men can use their income for other purposes than increasing living standards of their family. That's also possible. While in that case, women might need this additional income to sustain their family members, and not necessarily it is the man who needs to sustain the family. Women's female income might also be necessary. Income of the woman might also be necessary to sustain the family. So there was, at this time, this was one of the hottest discussion within the workers' movements, and women started to get out of the labor force, starting with the 20th century, however, and except the World War I and World War II, they remained mostly out of the labor force all the way to 1950s and especially 1970s. 1970s is considered as the time of the silent revolution, when women increasingly start to enter to the labor force once again. And that also created the effect of decreased the wages to some extent in 1970s. That was a crisis, and basically, as women entered to the labor force, kind of this created a new segment of population entering to the labor force, as well as, by the way, the migrants, the immigrants, not anymore from the land, but from the developing countries who are coming to the developed countries like European Union countries and the United States and Canada. So all of these new people coming to the labor force, once again, similar to some extent, beginning of the 19th century, have decreased the wages also. So to some extent, the new segments enter to the labor force. The time when they enter to the labor force intersects with the time when, well, maybe there is a need for decrease in wages, and it's the time when also, well, kind of either expanding production or existing economic crisis require, an extension of the labor force, basically. In 19th century, there was a high growth rate, the new machines, new factories required new labor force, and in the 1970s, basically, the economic crisis, the power of the labor unions, and basically labor rights at the citizenship level require kind of this new segments, women and the immigrant labor force, come to the labor force, and kind of those people were also willing to work for lower living standards, sometimes at the sometimes at the informal economic area even, and those things lower the wages and labor force and kind of make the world come out of the crisis of the 1970s, especially for the developed countries. The 1980s and 90s were still problematic for the developing countries like Turkey and Latin America. Anyway, so this is the end of the background. For math, we will start with the relations, and then we will see indifference curves, and then the slope of indifference curve, how it is defined. You might already know these things, but let me go as fast as I can through this. And if you have questions, if you need further knowledge, you might ask to me. A relation is basically relating numbers within a certain group that is representing a certain, let's say, usually variable in economics or natural sciences, to the numbers that are representing another variable, usually again in economics or natural sciences. So in this case, for example, our relation is, you can see how these 4 numbers are related to the different numbers in the second number group. Well, here basically 7 cannot be related to 2 different numbers, so that's a mistake. So 7 should be related only to one number, either 4 or 1. So assuming that 7 is only related to 4, the shape you see below is a relation by itself. So we will talk more on the relations in the next part of this lecture. See you in the next part.